Sometimes, the places we call home hold secrets we could never imagine. For 42-year-old Bonnie Walsh, the mountains of West Virginia had been her sanctuary for nearly her entire life. But one morning, everything changed. She was clearing an old trail when her German shepherd began to act strangely near a moss-covered knoll. That's when she found it. A steel door, sunk into the earth. Rusted shut and veiled by decades of overgrowth, the door finally gave way, releasing a stale breath from the past. What lay within wasn't merely forgotten. It had been deliberately buried. Now, Bonnie faces a choice that could change her quiet mountain town forever. What secret was so dangerous that it had to be entombed for 30 years? Before we return to her story, let us know in the comments where you're listening from. And if you find yourself drawn into this mystery, make sure you subscribe, because we have something very special for you tomorrow. The morning mist clung to the ridge like a familiar embrace as Bonnie Walsh stepped onto the weathered porch of her cabin, a mug of coffee in hand. At 42, she moved with the sure-footed confidence of someone who had walked these mountain paths for 4 decades. Her German shepherd, Rex, stretched beside her, his dark coat gleaming with dew. This had been their routine since her husband Robert passed away 3 years ago, a quiet communion with the West Virginia wilderness that had become more of a home than any place she had ever known. Bonnie's cabin was nestled in a grove of old-growth maples, their massive trunks telling stories older than the mining towns scattered through these hills. She had built this life by design, choosing the solace of the woods over the clamor of the world beyond the tree line. Robert had understood that in her, the way she could read the forest like a morning paper, finding her peace not in the noise of civilization, but in the steady rhythm of the seasons. The worn trail map tacked to her kitchen wall was a testament to decades of exploration. Hand-drawn in faded ink, it showed every deer trail, every hidden spring, every rocky outcrop she had discovered during her years volunteering for the state park's trail maintenance service. Each line represented hours of careful observation, of learning the moods and secrets of the mountains. She knew where the eagles nested, where the wild ginseng grew, and where the old-timers had carved their initials into beech trees that now towered over the younger growth. Rex nudged her elbow, signaling it was time for their morning hike. He was going gray around the muzzle now. At 10 years old, he'd been a pup from the county shelter, left on a back road by some fool. Robert had grumbled about another mouth to feed, but within a week, the dog had claimed his spot by the hearth, and with it, Robert's heart. "All right, boy," Bonnie said, scratching behind his ears. "Let's see what the mountain has to show us today." She pulled on her worn hiking boots and grabbed her canvas work gloves from the porch rail. Today's mission was to clear debris from the old logging trail, a neglected path that snaked through the state forest adjoining her property. Spring storm damage had left branches strewn across the route, and hikers had been complaining to the Park Service about the obstacles. The air was crisp with the promise of autumn. Though the trees were still dressed in the green of late summer, Bonnie took a deep breath, catching the scent of wild mint and the earthy smell of decaying leaves. This was her meditation, her church, her therapy, all rolled into a daily ritual that kept her grounded and gave her purpose. As they walked, Rex trotted ahead, investigating scents and sounds that escaped human perception. Bonnie fell into the familiar rhythm, her experienced eye noting the changes in the landscape. A new beaver dam upstream had raised the water level in Miller's Creek. The oaks were showing signs of an early acorn drop, suggesting a hard winter ahead. It was these kinds of observations that made her invaluable to the Park Service, despite her preference for working alone. The townspeople respected her knowledge but kept their distance. She wasn't unfriendly, just selective. Saturday mornings at Henderson's for supplies, the occasional chat with Patricia Vance at the library when she needed to research local flora, and polite nods to neighbors on the mountain roads. It was just enough social contact to remind her she was part of a community without overwhelming her natural inclination for solitude. Robert had been different, a geologist who had come to study the coal seams and stayed for the woman who knew more about these mountains than any book could teach him. Their courtship had unfolded slowly, like the turning of the seasons, built on shared silences and a mutual respect for the land that sustained them both. His sudden death from a heart attack had left a void in her daily routine, one she gradually learned to navigate, like stepping over a fallen log on a familiar trail. The logging trail began where her property met the state forest, marked by a weathered wooden sign that had seen better days. Bonnie pulled her clippers from the canvas bag slung over her shoulder and began the methodical work of clearing the path. Branch by branch, she restored order to the chaos left by the spring storms, creating neat piles of debris that would decompose naturally over the winter months. Rex had wandered off to investigate something in the brush, his movements creating small rustles in the ferns that carpeted the forest floor. Bonnie worked steadily, losing herself in the familiar rhythm of physical labor. It was honest work, the kind that left you tired but satisfied, connected to something larger than yourself. She was reaching for a particularly stubborn branch when Rex's sharp bark tore through the morning quiet. It wasn't his usual alert, the controlled yaps he used to announce squirrels or the occasional deer. This was different. It was urgent, laced with a fear she had never heard from him before. Bonnie straightened up, scanning the woods for whatever had caught his attention. "Rex? What is it, boy?" The barking continued, coming from a section of the forest she rarely visited. The terrain there was steep and unwelcoming, thick with thorn bushes and fallen trees that made passage difficult. But Rex's distress was genuine, and in all their years together, she had learned to trust his instincts about things that weren't right. Bonnie pushed her way through the undergrowth, following the sound of Rex's agitation. She found him circling a moss-covered mound that rose from the forest floor like a green tomb. His hackles were raised, and he kept a wary distance from whatever had captured his attention, whining softly in a way that made the hair on Bonnie's arms stand on end. The mound was larger than she'd first thought, maybe 8 feet across and extending back into the slope. The thick moss and decades of leaf litter gave it the appearance of a natural formation, but something about its shape seemed too regular, too deliberate. Vines grew over it in a tangled web that suggested years of uninterrupted growth, but beneath that green blanket, she could make out harder lines that didn't belong to nature. Bonnie knelt beside the mound, pulling back the moss and debris with her gloved hands. Her fingers met metal, cold, smooth, and unmistakably man-made. As she cleared away more of the growth, the outline became undeniable. A door set deep into the hillside, sealed by rust and time. Her heart began to beat faster as she worked to expose more of the structure. This was no old mine shaft or root cellar. The construction was too deliberate, too well hidden. Someone had gone to great lengths to conceal this entrance, and from the growth patterns around it, they had done so decades ago. Rex continued to pace nervously, occasionally letting out low growls that seemed to come from some primal instinct about hidden dangers. Bonnie sat back on her heels, studying the door she had uncovered. It was heavy steel with hinges that had been built to last, though rust now consumed them. There was a lock mechanism, but it too had succumbed to time and weather. She had lived in these mountains for 40 years. She had explored every visible inch of the surrounding forest, and never once suspected something like this existed so close to her daily walks. The secrecy of it unsettled her almost as much as the mystery of what lay beyond that steel barrier. Rising slowly, Bonnie made a decision that would change everything about her quiet mountain existence. She was going to find a way to open that door. Despite Rex's obvious warnings and her own growing unease about the secrets the mountain had kept from her all these years, it took Bonnie 3 days to gather the courage to return to the hidden door with the tools to open it. She spent those days in a state of distracted restlessness, unable to settle into her usual routines. Even Rex seemed to sense her preoccupation, staying closer than usual and watching her with intelligent brown eyes that seemed to hold questions she had no answers for. On Thursday morning, she packed her canvas bag with a crowbar, a powerful flashlight, and the handheld radio she used for emergencies in the woods. The rational part of her mind insisted she should report the discovery to the Park Service or the county sheriff, but something held her back. A growing certainty that this secret had been kept for a very good reason, and that involving the authorities might do more harm than good. Rex was reluctant to accompany her back to the site, hanging back as they approached the mossy mound. When they reached the clearing, he settled himself 20 feet away and lay down, his chin on his paws, watching with the resigned air of a dog whose owner had decided to do something profoundly foolish. The door seemed less sinister in the morning light, more like an abandoned relic than a gateway to danger. Bonnie had half convinced herself she would find nothing more threatening than old mining equipment, or perhaps a forgotten storage area for park supplies. The mountain was full of relics from bygone eras, concrete foundations of long-gone cabins, rusting machinery from failed mining ventures, cellars that had outlived the homes they once served. Wedging the crowbar into the seam between the door and its frame, Bonnie applied steady pressure. The metal groaned in protest. Flakes of rust fell like red snow as the hinges fought against decades of corrosion. It took nearly 30 minutes of patient work before something gave way with a sharp crack that echoed through the quiet woods. The door swung inward on protesting hinges, releasing a puff of stale air that carried a scent of old metal and something else, something organic and unpleasant that made Bonnie recoil. Rex whined from his lookout post, but made no move to come closer. Bonnie clicked on her flashlight and peered through the opening. The beam revealed rough concrete walls and a narrow passage stretching back into the hillside, farther than the light could reach. This was no natural cave or simple storage area. Someone had excavated this space with purpose and permanence in mind. She called out tentatively, "Hello?" but received only the echo of her own voice in reply. The lack of any response was somehow more unsettling than if someone had answered. At least then she would know what she was dealing with. Taking a deep breath of fresh air before committing, Bonnie crossed to the threshold. The passage was just wide enough for one person, with a concrete floor that showed signs of regular use, despite the door's rusted exterior. After about 20 feet, the tunnel opened into a larger chamber, which her flashlight revealed to be roughly square, perhaps 12 feet on each side. What she found there made her stop in her tracks. The room was furnished like an office, though it had not been occupied in years. A metal desk sat against the far wall, its surface coated in dust and the remains of what had once been organized paperwork. Filing cabinets lined another wall, their drawers partially open, as if someone had left in a hurry. But it was the equipment that truly captured her attention. arrays of electronic devices that looked like radios or surveillance equipment, their screens dark and silent, but somehow still radiating an aura of watchfulness. Bonnie moved slowly toward the desk, her flashlight beam dancing over scattered papers and manila folders. Most of the documents were too water-damaged or faded to read clearly, but she could make out official-looking letterheads and what appeared to be surveillance reports. Her hands trembled slightly as she picked up a folder that was in better condition than the rest. Inside, she found a photograph that made her breath catch in her throat. 5 men in dark suits stood before what she recognized as the town hall, their expressions severe and official. The photograph was stamped with the year 1993, and someone had circled one of the faces in red ink. She knew 3 of the men instantly. Tom Bradley Sr., who had been sheriff before his son took over the post. Dr. Marcus Webb, who had run the town's medical clinic until his retirement. And James Morrison, who had served as mayor all through the 90s. But it was the circled face that sent a chill down her spine. The man was older than the others, with graying hair and eyes that seemed to stare right at her through the faded emulsion. There was something familiar in his features, though she couldn't place where she had seen him before. A sound from the entrance made her freeze. Rex's anxious barking had stopped, replaced by the soft padding of paws on concrete. She turned to see his silhouette in the doorway, backlit by the morning sun. He had finally overcome his reluctance to enter, but his posture remained tense, alert. "It's okay, boy," she whispered, though she wasn't sure she believed it herself. Rex approached cautiously, his nose working, processing the complex scents in the confined space. When he reached her side, he pressed himself against her leg in a way that was both comforting and protective. Whatever this place was, it didn't feel abandoned to him either. Bonnie continued her exploration, pulling open file drawers and discovering more photographs, documents that looked like surveillance reports, and maps of the surrounding area marked with cryptic symbols and notations. One map showed her own property, her cabin marked with a small red X and what appeared to be observation points noted in the surrounding forest. The implication of this discovery hit her like a physical blow. Someone had been watching her home, documenting her movements, treating her property as a subject of surveillance. The violation of privacy was staggering, but it was the systematic nature of it that truly frightened her. This wasn't the work of some local busybody or harmless eccentric. It was professional, organized, and thorough. In the bottom drawer of the largest file cabinet, she found equipment that confirmed her worst fears: radio transceivers, recording devices, and what looked like encryption hardware. It was all far more sophisticated than anything she expected to find in these mountains. Some of the devices still had power indicators that glowed faintly in the gloom, suggesting someone had maintained this equipment more recently than the dusty surfaces implied. As if summoned by her growing unease, one of the radios suddenly crackled to life. A burst of static filled the room, followed by a voice so clear and unexpected that Bonnie nearly dropped her flashlight. "Unit 7, this is base. Report." The voice was male, middle-aged, and spoke with the dry efficiency of someone accustomed to giving orders. Bonnie stood paralyzed, afraid to move or breathe, waiting to see if the transmission would continue. After a long moment, the radio fell silent again, but the message was clear. Whatever operation this facility had been built for, it was not as dormant as the dust suggested. Someone was still out there, still monitoring, still waiting for reports from Unit 7. Bonnie realized with a surge of alarm that by opening this door, she had inserted herself into something far more dangerous than a forgotten piece of local history. This was an active operation, and her discovery had almost certainly been noted by whoever was responsible for maintaining the equipment. Rex pressed harder against her leg, his warm presence a reminder that she was not alone in this subterranean tomb. But as she looked around at the evidence of systematic surveillance and organized secrecy, Bonnie couldn't shake the feeling that they were both now in more danger than they had ever been in her 4 decades of mountain life. The photograph, with its circled face, seemed to stare up at her from the desk, its subject holding secrets someone thought were worth burying. As the radio equipment hummed silently in the darkness around her, Bonnie made a decision that would change her life forever. She would not report this discovery to the authorities. Not yet. First, she needed to understand what she had stumbled into, who was responsible, and whether the danger was something she could run from, or something that would follow her home. Gathering the photograph and as many documents as she could safely carry, Bonnie began the careful work of documenting everything else with her phone's camera. Whatever secrets this mountain bunker held, she was going to drag them into the light of day, even if it put her directly in the crosshairs of people who had already proven they would go to extreme lengths to keep their activities hidden. Bonnie spent the weekend in a state of cautious paranoia, studying the documents from the bunker while keeping one eye on the windows of her cabin. The photograph haunted her. 5 men in suits, standing as if they owned the world. One face circled in red ink, as if marked for special attention. She laid the documents out on her kitchen table, creating a timeline of dates and cross-referencing the faces with her memories of the town's past. Tom Bradley Sr. She remembered him clearly. A stern man who ran the sheriff's department with an iron fist until he retired in 2001. Dr. Webb had delivered half the babies in the county during his 40 years of practice, earning a reputation for competence and discretion that had made him wealthy by local standards. James Morrison had been mayor during the town's brief economic boom, back when coal prices were high and the mining companies were hiring. But the circled face remained a mystery, though something about the man's features nagged at her memory, like a half-forgotten dream. On Monday morning, she was at the county library 20 minutes before it opened, waiting on the steps with the patience of someone who had spent decades observing wildlife. Patricia Vance unlocked the doors promptly at 9 o'clock, greeting Bonnie with the pleasant surprise of a librarian whose quiet domain was rarely visited so early. "Bonnie Walsh, alive and well," Patricia said, adjusting her reading glasses as she disarmed the security system. "What brings you down from the mountain at this hour?" Patricia was one of the few people in town Bonnie considered a friend, though their relationship was built more on mutual respect than intimate conversation. She had been the head librarian for 15 years, replacing old Mrs. Henderson when arthritis finally forced her into retirement. Patricia understood the value of information and discretion, qualities that served her well in a small town where everyone's business was potentially everyone else's entertainment. "Research project," Bonnie said, following Patricia inside. "Trying to identify some people in an old photograph. Local folks from the 90s. The lie came easily, though Bonnie felt a pang of discomfort at deceiving someone she trusted. But the radio transmission from the bunker had convinced her that whatever she was uncovering was still dangerous. Involving Patricia without more information would be unfair to them both. Patricia led her to the local history section, a collection of bound newspapers, high school yearbooks, and photo albums that documented the town's evolution from a mining camp to a tourist destination. They worked together in a comfortable silence, Patricia pulling volumes while Bonnie searched through photos of town council meetings, business openings, and civic events from the 1990s. It was in a 1993 edition of the County Herald that they found it. A front-page story about a federal grant for rural law enforcement included the same photograph Bonnie had discovered in the bunker, though this version was unmarked by red ink. The caption identified the circled man as Special Agent Robert Henshaw, a representative of the Federal Task Force for Rural Crime Prevention. "I remember him," Patricia said quietly, studying the photo over Bonnie's shoulder. "He was around for about 6 months that year, supposedly helping coordinate some kind of anti-drug initiative. Quiet man, kept to himself, stayed at the Morrison Inn until he finished whatever it was he was doing." Bonnie felt her pulse quicken. A federal agent, working closely with local authorities, whose presence apparently warranted special documentation by whoever had established the surveillance operation. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to form a pattern, though she still didn't understand what picture they were creating. "Did you know any of the other men in the picture?" Bonnie asked, trying to keep her tone casual. Patricia pointed to each face in turn. "Tom Bradley, of course, Dr. Webb, Mayor Morrison. The fifth one is Carl Winters. He was the county medical examiner back then. Retired and moved to Florida around 2000, if I remember right. 5 men, all in positions of authority, all working with a federal agent on some kind of law enforcement initiative." Bonnie made careful notes, though she could feel Patricia's curiosity growing with each question. "This wouldn't have anything to do with those odd questions you were asking about local history last month, would it?" Patricia asked, her librarian's instinct detecting a pattern Bonnie had hoped to keep hidden. The question caught Bonnie off guard. She had forgotten her casual inquiry about families who had abruptly left town during the 90s, a conversation that had seemed innocent at the time but now felt like a dangerous revelation of her interest in that specific period. "Just trying to piece together some family history," Bonnie said. But she could tell from Patricia's expression that the explanation wasn't entirely convincing. They spent another hour poring over documents, finding additional references to Agent Henshaw's task force and the federal grants that had funded the expansion of surveillance resources for rural authorities. The more they uncovered, the more legitimate the operation appeared to be, which only deepened Bonnie's confusion about the hidden bunker and its sophisticated equipment. As they prepared to leave, Patricia touched Bonnie's arm gently. "If you're looking into something that might be dangerous, you should know you're not the first person to ask questions about that period." Bonnie felt her stomach clench. "What do you mean?" "About 5 years ago, a young reporter from Charleston came around, asking about federal operations in the 90s. He was particularly interested in families that moved away suddenly. Very persistent, very thorough." Patricia paused, lowering her voice. "He had a car accident on Highway 9 about a week after his last visit. Single vehicle. Went off the road in broad daylight. State police said he fell asleep at the wheel. The implication hung between them like a threat neither woman wanted to acknowledge directly. But Bonnie understood the message. Her research was treading a path that had already proven fatal for at least one other person." "I appreciate the warning," Bonnie said carefully. Patricia nodded, then disappeared into the stacks for a moment, before returning with a manila envelope. "These are photocopies of everything we found today, plus some additional material I thought might be relevant. Consider it a starter kit for your family history project." Walking back to her truck, Bonnie felt the weight of the envelope like a burden she wasn't sure she was ready to carry. The radio equipment in the bunker suddenly seemed less like abandoned technology and more like an active threat, monitoring frequencies someone was still using to coordinate activities she didn't understand. As she drove home on the mountain road she had traveled safely for 40 years, Bonnie found herself checking her rearview mirror more often than usual. The landscape that had always represented security and solitude now felt exposed and vulnerable, as if hidden eyes were tracking her movements from positions she couldn't identify. Back at the cabin, she spread Patricia's materials on the kitchen table alongside the documents from the bunker. The pattern that emerged was disturbing in its implications. Federal agents working with local authorities, families moving away suddenly, and a surveillance operation sophisticated enough to require permanent, underground facilities. Rex watched her work from his favorite spot by the hearth, occasionally lifting his head to stare at the door, as if sensing an approaching danger. His unease was becoming contagious, and Bonnie found herself questioning every sound from the forest, every creak of the cabin's aging timbers. As dusk fell, she made a decision that would have seemed paranoid just a week before. She loaded her grandfather's old hunting rifle and set it by the front door. Then she checked the locks on every window before settling in to continue her research. The photograph of Agent Henshaw looked up at her from the table. His face, branded with a circle, was a reminder that some secrets commanded special attention from people who had the resources and the motivation to keep them buried. But Bonnie Walsh had spent 40 years learning the secrets of the mountain, and she was not about to be intimidated by people who thought they could hide their activities in her backyard. If they wanted to play games of surveillance and intimidation, they would find that mountain folk had their own ways of watching and waiting. The question was whether she could uncover the truth before the bunker's custodians decided she knew too much to continue her investigation. Her return trip to the bunker on Tuesday was driven by a discovery that had kept her awake most of the night. Hidden among Patricia's materials was a reference to a joint federal-local operation called Project Clearwater, a name that appeared in no official documents, but was mentioned in a single letter to the editor, published in the Herald's opinion section and quickly retracted. The letter, written by someone identified only as a concerned citizen, questioned the sudden disappearance of 3 local families and suggested federal authorities were involved in relocating people without proper documentation. The retraction, published a week later, claimed the letter was based on unfounded rumors and apologized for any distress caused to the families mentioned. But those families, the Kowalskis, the Hendersons, and the Santoses, had indeed vanished from city records after 1993, leaving behind properties that were quickly sold at auction and businesses that closed without explanation. Bonnie now recalled that she had known some of these people, had seen them at Henderson's General Store and at the annual Harvest Festival. Their absence from her memory wasn't due to the passage of time, but to their careful erasure from the community's consciousness. This time, Rex refused to approach the bunker, taking up a sentinel's post at the edge of the clearing, where he could watch both the hidden entrance and the forest paths leading back to safety. His reluctance was absolute, and Bonnie didn't blame him. The place felt different now that she understood it was part of an active operation, not an abandoned relic. Inside the concrete chamber, she went directly to the filing cabinets with a more systematic approach. The bottom drawer of the largest cabinet had a false back she hadn't noticed in her first exploration. Behind it, she found a leather-bound journal that someone had hidden with great care. The journal's pages were filled with handwritten entries dated from March to September of 1993. The writing was precise and analytical, the work of someone accustomed to keeping detailed records. As Bonnie read by the light of her flashlight, the scope of Project Clearwater began to reveal itself in terms that chilled her to the bone. March 15th. Henderson family confirmed suitable for relocation. Father's gambling debts provide necessary leverage for cooperation. Children, ages 8 and 12, will require careful handling during transition. April 3rd. Santos relocation proceeding on schedule. Mother's immigration status irregularities, discovered through surveillance, provide excellent motivation for compliance. No resistance anticipated. May 18th. Kowalski's situation complicated by father's military background. Recommend expedited processing to minimize security risks. Unit 7 reports a suspicious activity from subject's military contacts. Page after page detailed the systematic identification, surveillance, and relocation of families who seem to have been selected based on vulnerabilities that could be exploited to ensure their cooperation. But relocated where? And why was such an elaborate operation necessary for what seemed to be a voluntary departure? The answer came in the journal's final entries. Written in September 1993, the handwriting grew less controlled, the observations more personal and disturbing. September 12th. Project parameters have exceeded acceptable limits. Recommendation to suspend current protocols ignored by federal oversight. Local team expressing concerns about permanent solutions being implemented without proper authorization. September 20th. Henshaw's meeting with federal contacts resulted in a stand-down order. All local operations to cease within 72 hours. Site to be sealed and abandoned. Personnel sworn to permanent silence under national security provisions. September 23rd. Final entry. I cannot, in good conscience, continue to participate. The equipment is to be left operational for monitoring purposes, but the active phase is terminated. May God help us all for what we've allowed to happen here. The last page of the journal held a list of names that made Bonnie's hands tremble as she read them. The 3 families who had been relocated were listed alongside dates and a single word that appeared next to each entry. Terminated. Not relocated. Terminated. Bonnie leaned back in the metal chair, the journal shaking in her hands as the full horror of her discovery washed over her. These weren't voluntary relocations or witness protection programs. They were executions, carried out under the guise of a federal operation and concealed through the systematic erasure of evidence. The families she remembered from her early years in the mountains, families with children who played in the same woods she now walked, had been murdered by the very people sworn to protect them. And the entire operation had been documented, recorded, and filed away in this hidden bunker, like evidence for a case that would never go to trial. But who had written the journal? The handwriting didn't match any of the official documents, and the tone suggested someone who had been present for the operations, but had grown increasingly uneasy with their escalation. Someone with a conscience who had tried to stand against what was happening. The answer came from a manila envelope tucked behind the false panel. Inside, she found a federal ID for Special Agent Robert Henshaw, the man whose face was circled in red ink in the photograph. But the card wasn't just an ID. Attached to it was a handwritten note in the same script as the journal entries. If you are reading this, then someone has discovered what we did here. I tried to stop it, but by the time I understood the true scope of the operation, it was too late to save the families who had already been processed. The equipment is still active, because they are still out there. The people who ordered these murders, they monitor these frequencies to ensure witnesses like me remain silent. If you want to survive your discovery, trust no one in an official capacity. The conspiracy includes federal agents, local authorities, and civilians. My death was not a suicide, regardless of how it was made to look. Harry Henshaw, September 1993. Bonnie read the note 3 times before its implications fully sank in. Agent Henshaw had been trying to expose the operation, not lead it. His presence in the official photograph now made sense. He was documenting evidence of crimes committed under federal authority, not coordinating them. And if his note was correct, then the people responsible for the murders were still active, still monitoring the radio frequencies, still willing to kill to protect their secrets. The young reporter who died in a car crash, Agent Henshaw's supposed suicide. How many other people had discovered pieces of this puzzle and paid with their lives? The radio equipment suddenly seemed less like abandoned technology and more like a spider's web, waiting to detect any vibration that might indicate someone was getting too close to the truth. As if summoned by her thoughts, one of the units crackled to life. Base to Unit 7. Unusual activity detected at Site C. Investigate and report. Unit 7. The designation appeared in the journal entries, always in connection with surveillance and monitoring activities. Someone was still out there, still watching, still reporting to whoever had taken over the operation after Agent Henshaw's death. Bonnie took the journal and the ID card, her hands moving quickly as the gravity of the situation became clear. She had stumbled into a conspiracy that had already claimed multiple lives, and her discovery of the bunker had almost certainly been detected by whatever monitoring systems were still running. As she prepared to leave the chamber, the radio hissed again. Unit 7 to base. Subject is inside Site C, has been for 37 minutes. Recommend immediate intervention. The voice was local, familiar in the way that small-town voices have distinct patterns and inflections. Someone she might have passed on the street. Someone who was now watching her movements and reporting them to handlers who had proven their willingness to kill. Bonnie switched off her flashlight and moved toward the entrance in the darkness, guided by the faint rectangle of daylight that marked the door. Rex's anxious barking reached her from the clearing, and she could see his silhouette pacing back and forth, as if sensing the approaching danger. She stepped out of the bunker into the morning sunlight, which felt like a reprieve, but the feeling was short-lived. Rex's attention was fixed on the tree line beyond the clearing. His posture was rigid, with the focused intensity he displayed when tracking dangerous prey. Someone was out there, watching, reporting, and likely coordinating her elimination. Just as they had eliminated Agent Henshaw, the young reporter, and anyone else who got too close to the truth about Project Clearwater. The mountain that had been her sanctuary for 40 years had become a hunting ground, and Bonnie Walsh was now the prey. The medical records Bonnie discovered in a hidden compartment beneath the bunker's main filing cabinet told a story so systematic and complete it left her breathless. The death certificates for all 3 families were signed by Dr. Marcus Webb and authenticated by the county medical examiner, Carl Winters. The documented causes of death read like a catalog of convenient accidents and sudden illnesses. James Henderson, heart attack, age 34, no autopsy performed. Maria Santos, car accident, single vehicle rollover, no witnesses. Paul Kowalski, hunting accident, accidental firearm discharge. The children's deaths were listed as complications from the same incidents that claimed their parents. Maria Santos's 8-year-old daughter had reportedly died from injuries sustained in the same car crash, while the Henderson and Kowalski children had succumbed to various medical emergencies that coincidentally occurred just days after their parents' deaths. But it was the medical examiner's notes, handwritten in the margins and on separate sheets of paper, that revealed the true horror of what had been done. Dr. Webb had documented evidence that contradicted every official cause of death. gunshot wounds that didn't match hunting accidents, trauma patterns inconsistent with vehicle crashes, and toxicology results that had been deliberately omitted from the final reports. Patient presents with defensive wounds on hands and forearms consistent with a struggle, read a note attached to James Henderson's file. Bullet trajectory inconsistent with stated circumstances. Further investigation recommended. But that recommendation had been crossed out in red ink, replaced by a notation that read, "Case closed by federal directive." Each family's medical records contained similar discrepancies. The evidence of violence had been systematically documented and then officially ignored. Dr. Webb had been thorough in his examinations, recording details that painted a clear picture of multiple homicides disguised as accidents and natural deaths. Bonnie found herself sitting on the cold, concrete floor of the bunker, surrounded by proof of murders committed 30 years ago and covered up by the very people the community trusted to protect it. The weight of the truth was overwhelming, not just because of the crimes themselves, but because of how completely they had been erased from collective memory. She now remembered attending the funerals for some of these families. The community had rallied around the tragic losses, bringing casseroles and flowers, offering comfort to survivors who had not, in fact, survived. The entire town had been manipulated into mourning fictional accidents, while the real victims lay buried in graves that held secrets instead of peace. But where were the actual burial sites? The funeral home records showed that all three families had been cremated, an unusual choice for a community where traditional burial was the norm. The cremations were expedited, completed within 48 hours of death, with the ashes supposedly scattered at locations chosen by surviving relatives who didn't exist. This meant the bodies had been disposed of in a way that eliminated any possibility of future examination or investigation. The murders hadn't just been committed. They had been planned with a kind of meticulousness that suggested professional experience in covering up violent crimes. Bonnie's hands shook as she photographed each document with her phone, building a digital archive of evidence that might be the only proof these families had ever existed. The systematic nature of the cover-up suggested that other evidence had been deliberately destroyed, leaving the bunker's files as the sole record of what had really happened. As she worked, a sound from outside made her freeze. Rex was barking again, but this time his alarm was continuous and urgent, the kind of warning he gave when strangers approached their territory. Bonnie switched off her phone's camera and listened intently, trying to gauge the degree of immediate danger she faced. The footsteps were deliberate and careful, but not cautious enough to avoid detection by a dog whose hearing had been honed by years of life in the mountains. Someone was approaching the bunker, and they were trying to move quietly over terrain that made stealth nearly impossible. Bonnie gathered the most critical documents and stuffed them into her jacket. Then she moved toward the back wall of the chamber, where the shadows offered the best cover. If whoever was approaching intended to trap her in the bunker, she needed to understand their intentions before deciding whether to attempt an escape or remain hidden. The footsteps stopped just outside the entrance. Rex's barking ceased, replaced by a low growl that vibrated through the floorboards. It was his defensive sound, the one that meant he was ready to either fight or flee, depending on how the situation unfolded. Bonnie held her breath and waited. "Mrs. Walsh?" The voice was elderly, hesitant, and distinctly local. "I know you're in there. I saw you go in, and I need to talk to you before it's too late." The accent was pure Appalachian, aged and worn as dry timber. Whoever was speaking had lived in these hills for decades, long enough to develop the distinct cadence that marked a lifelong resident. But that didn't mean he was safe to trust. The locals had been part of the conspiracy from the very beginning. My name is Jimmy Kowalski. Paul was my older brother. The name struck Bonnie like a physical blow. According to the medical records, Paul Kowalski had died in a hunting accident back in September of 1993. If this man was telling the truth, she was speaking to a survivor, someone who had lost family in the Clearwater Project murders and might hold answers to questions she didn't even know how to ask. I've waited 30 years for someone to find this place, the voice continued. Waited for someone brave enough, or foolish enough, to open that door and see what we did here. We, not them. Jimmy Kowalski was involved in whatever had happened to his own brother's family. The implication of that admission made Bonnie's stomach churn, but she forced herself to remain calm, to assess the situation rationally. I'm coming out, she yelled, forcing a confidence into her voice that she didn't feel. But my dog is protective and I'm armed. The last part was a lie. Her rifle was back at the cabin, but Jimmy Kowalski didn't need to know that. If he meant her harm, a little misdirection might buy her time to escape, or at least make him reconsider his approach. Bonnie stepped out of the bunker and found an old man standing 20 feet away, his hands raised in a gesture of surrender. He was thin and weathered, probably in his 70s, with the deep, leathery tan that comes from decades of working outdoors. Rex stood between them, hackles raised but not advancing, reading the man's body language for any sign of a threat. I had no choice, Jimmy said, his voice cracking with an emotion that felt genuine. They said if I didn't help them, they'd kill my wife and my children too. So I dug the graves, and I kept my mouth shut for 30 years. The confession hung in the air between them, a challenge forcing Bonnie to decide if she was talking to a victim or a perpetrator. The distinction was critical. One might offer help in uncovering the truth. The other might be laying a trap to silence her for good. Tell me what happened to your brother, Bonnie said, keeping her distance but allowing the conversation to continue. Jimmy's face contorted with a grief he had carefully hidden for 3 decades. They made me watch, he whispered. Said I needed to understand what happens to people who don't cooperate with federal investigations. Paul. He tried to fight them. He was a good soldier, trained for combat. But there were 4 of them, and they had his kids. The old man sank onto a fallen log, suddenly looking every one of his 70-plus years. They killed the children first, made Paul and his wife watch. Then they finished the job. Professional work, quick and clean. Then they handed me a shovel and told me where to dig. Bonnie felt sick, but she forced herself to ask the crucial question. Where did you bury them? Jimmy pointed toward a stretch of woods Bonnie had walked through a dozen times over the years. 400 yards that way, near the old lightning-struck oak. 3 graves, unmarked, but not unfindable if you know where to look. I carved little symbols into the nearby trees. Nothing obvious, but something to help me remember where they rest. The revelation that she had been walking past the victims of a decades-old murder made the mountain feel alien and dangerous in ways she had never imagined. But Jimmy's willingness to reveal the burial sites suggested either genuine remorse or an elaborate trap to lead her into an ambush. Why are you telling me this now? She asked. Because they're getting old and careless, Jimmy replied. Because new people are asking questions, and the radio traffic is up again. Because I'm dying of cancer, and I'm not going to my grave carrying their secrets. He reached slowly into his coat pocket, pulling out a small, well-worn notebook. I kept records, too. Names, dates, places, everything I could remember about who was involved and how they did it. Always figured there might be a reckoning one day. The notebook was worn leather, its pages filled with handwritten script that seemed to span decades. Jimmy held it out to her like an offering, his hands trembling from age, or emotion, or both. "They're still out there," he said. "The ones who gave the orders, the ones who coordinated the cover-up. They think they're safe because enough time has passed and most of the witnesses are dead. But they're wrong." Bonnie took the notebook, its weight feeling disproportionate to its physical size. Inside, she found names she recognized: current and former public officials, business leaders, people she saw around town and had never suspected of being involved in anything more sinister than local politics. "How many others know about this?" she asked. "Fewer every year," Jimmy answered. "Most of the men who participated are gone now. Heart attacks, strokes, accidents that probably weren't accidents. The ones still alive are the ones who gave orders instead of digging graves." As if summoned by their conversation, the radio equipment inside the bunker crackled to life again. This time, the transmission was clear and urgent. "All units, we have a security breach at Site C. Female subject with local assistance. Immediate containment protocol is advised." Jimmy's face went pale. "They know you're here. They know I'm talking to you. We have to get out of this place right now before they send someone to clean up the mess we're making." The old man got to his feet with a surprising agility, his urgency overriding the physical limitations that had seemed to burden him moments before. "Your truck, where'd you park it?" "On the old logging road, about a quarter-mile south," Bonnie answered, Rex moving closer to her as if sensing the immediate need to leave. "Too obvious. They'll have it covered by now." Jimmy pointed toward a section of forest that looked impenetrable. "There's an old mining road through there. Connects to Route 9 about 3 miles down the mountain. If we hurry and stay quiet, we might make it there before they can get people in position to intercept us." The choice was stark and immediate. Trust a man who had just confessed to being part of a murder conspiracy, or face whatever containment protocol the voices on the radio had in mind for security breaches. Neither option offered much hope of survival. But Jimmy Kowalski had just handed her 30 years of evidence that could finally bring justice to 3 murdered families. And sometimes, in the mountains as in life, you had to choose the devil you knew over the one that remained hidden in the shadows. The abandoned mining road Jimmy led them down was barely visible under 30 years of forest reclamation, but it provided cover from the main trails where their pursuers would expect them to travel. Rex scouted ahead, his natural hunting instincts now adapted to detecting human threats instead of wildlife. Every few minutes he would freeze and listen, his ears swiveling like radar dishes to pick up sounds that escaped human perception. Jimmy moved through the forest with the confidence of someone who had spent decades learning its secrets for purposes darker than recreation. He knew where the ground was solid enough to move silently, which routes avoided clearings where they might be spotted from above, and how to navigate by landmarks invisible to casual observers. "They use drones now," he said quietly, as they paused behind a massive fallen oak. "Started about 5 years ago, after that reporter got too close to the truth. Thermal imaging, motion detection, the whole high-tech arsenal. That's how they knew you were visiting the bunker." The revelation that they were being tracked by surveillance technology made the forest feel exposed and vulnerable. Bonnie found herself looking up through the canopy, listening for mechanical sounds that might indicate aerial observers documenting their escape route. "How do you know their methods?" she asked. Jimmy's expression grew darker. "Because they never really let me go. Once you're part of something like this, you're in for life. They used me as a local asset for 30 years, watching, listening, reporting anything unusual in the community. I'm what they call a passive monitor, someone who looks like a harmless old-timer but is really functioning as an early warning system. The confession explained how her activities at the bunker had been detected so quickly. Jimmy had likely been reporting her movements for weeks before she ever found the secret entrance. But his decision to help her now suggested either a genuine change of heart or an elaborate trap she was willingly walking into. "Why should I trust you?" Bonnie asked, her voice flat. "Because I'm dying," Jimmy replied, with the matter-of-fact tone of someone who has accepted a grim reality. "Pancreatic cancer. Diagnosed 6 months ago. Got 6 weeks left. Maybe 8, if I'm unlucky. After 30 years of keeping their secrets, I'd like to spend my last days trying to make things right." They reached the remains of an old mining camp, a scatter of concrete foundations and rusting equipment abandoned when the coal seams ran dry in the 1970s. Jimmy led them to a structure that had once been an equipment shed, its corrugated metal walls offering shelter from the weather and from observation. Inside, Jimmy revealed why he had brought them to this specific place. Hidden beneath a carefully camouflaged floor panel was a trove of documents, photographs, and recording equipment that represented 3 decades of secret documentation. "I learned from Agent Henshaw's mistake," Jimmy explained, as he opened weatherproof containers filled with evidence. "He tried to work within the system, tried to report the crimes through official channels. They killed him for it and made it look like a suicide. So I decided to build my own case, gathering proof slowly and carefully, waiting for the right time to use it." The materials Jimmy had collected were extensive and damning. Photographs of midnight meetings between local officials and unidentified federal agents. Audio recordings of conversations that revealed the ongoing nature of the conspiracy. Financial records showing payments from shell companies into local bank accounts. Names, dates, and locations that connected current crimes to the original Clearwater Project murders. But the most shocking discovery was a binder labeled Current Operations, which contained surveillance reports on recent activities in the area. The conspiracy hadn't ended with the 93 murders. It had evolved into an ongoing criminal enterprise that used the remote mountain locations and for activities that demanded total secrecy and the ruthless enforcement of silence. "Drug trafficking," Jimmy explained, as Bonnie studied shipping manifests and distribution maps. "They use the old mining roads and the access to federal forest to move product from Mexican suppliers to East Coast markets. The original murders were about eliminating witnesses, but the operation grew into something much bigger and much more profitable." The documents depicted a sophisticated network that had been operating for decades, protected by the same combination of official corruption and violent intimidation that had concealed the original crimes. Local law enforcement, federal agents, and civilian officials had been systematically compromised through bribery, blackmail, or threats that made cooperation seem like the only viable option for survival. "Tom Bradley Jr. took over for his father," Jimmy said, pointing to surveillance photos showing the current sheriff meeting with known criminals. "Same corruption, new generation. They recruit young deputies and officials, get them involved in small compromises, then raise the stakes until it's impossible to back out." Bonnie realized her discovery of the bunker had threatened an operation worth millions of dollars and protected by people who had already proven their willingness to commit murder. The radio transmissions she'd overheard weren't just for monitoring. They were coordinating an active criminal enterprise that treated murder as a routine business expense. "Patricia Vance has been asking questions too," Jimmy continued, producing a surveillance file that made Bonnie's heart sink. "They've been monitoring her research into local history, her conversations with visitors, her access to archival materials. She's on their list." The surveillance report on Patricia was detailed and menacing. Photos of her daily routine, transcripts of phone conversations, and assessments of her potential to cause problems for the operation. It was the same kind of documentation that had preceded the murders of the three families back in 1993. "We have to warn her," Bonnie said, her voice tight. "Warning her won't be enough," Jimmy replied grimly. "They're past warnings. The decision's been made to eliminate the current threats before they can expose the operation. That includes you, Patricia, and anyone else who might hold a piece of the puzzle." As if summoned by their conversation, the low growl of engines drifted through the forest. Several vehicles were moving slowly along the main road, likely coordinating a search pattern designed to pinpoint their location. Rex's posture went rigid, his ears pricked and his nose working, sifting the scents carried on the wind. "We need to get to Patricia before they do," Bonnie said, gathering the most critical documents from Jimmy's cache. "She's not at the library," Jimmy said, glancing at his watch. "Tuesday afternoons, she volunteers at the senior center, helping the older residents with paperwork and government forms. They'll know her schedule better than she does." The senior center was in the middle of town, surrounded by businesses and residential areas that would make any rescue attempt highly visible to civilians and to the people hunting them. But it also meant Patricia was surrounded by witnesses, people who might ask questions if she vanished or had an accident in broad daylight. "How do we get to her without walking into a trap?" Bonnie asked. Jimmy offered a dark smile, pulling out a radio that looked like the equipment they'd seen in the bunker. "We use their own communications against them. I've been monitoring their frequencies for years, learning the procedures, the code words. It's time to put that knowledge to use." He switched on the radio and began scanning, hunting for the coordination chatter that would betray the positions and intentions of their pursuers. After a few minutes, he found it. Voices, clipped and professional, discussing the deployment of assets around potential target locations. "Unit 3 is in position at the library. Unit 5 is observing the senior center. Unit 7 is coordinating with local assets, shutting down routes 9 and 15. The scale of the operation was staggering. They weren't just dealing with a few corrupt officials trying to cover up old crimes. This was a well-funded, professionally organized network, with resources that included multiple teams of trained agents and the cooperation of local law enforcement. "How many people are in on this?" Bonnie whispered. "More than you'd think. Less than they want us to believe," Jimmy answered. "The core group is maybe 8 or 10 people, but they've cultivated a network of passive collaborators who provide information and assistance without understanding the full scope of what they're supporting." He pointed to names on a list: local business owners, county officials, and federal employees who had been compromised through various forms of coercion. Most of these people think they're helping with legitimate law enforcement activities or national security operations. They don't know about the murders or the drug trafficking. The radio crackled again, this time with a broadcast that made them both freeze. "All units. Priority target is a female, approximately 60, accompanied by an older male and a large dog. Last seen moving southeast from location C. Orders are to detain for questioning. Eliminate if resistance is met." Detain for questioning. The euphemism fooled neither of them. They had seen the results of Project Clearwater's interrogation techniques, documented in the coroner's reports. "We're out of time," Jimmy said, packing his gear. "If we're going to save Patricia and expose this, we have to move now, before they can consolidate their positions and eliminate every last witness." But as they prepared to leave the abandoned mine shack, Bonnie realized their situation had evolved beyond simple survival. They were now the only people who held the complete story of a criminal conspiracy that had operated successfully for 30 years. The weight of that responsibility was crushing, but it was also liberating. For the first time in her adult life, Bonnie Walsh knew exactly what she had to do, even if it meant facing dangers that could cost her everything she had built in these mountains she called home. The federal badge Jimmy pulled from the deepest compartment of his evidence stash was not old or corroded, like the documents they had been examining. The ID card was current, issued just 2 years ago to Special Agent Maria Santos, the same Maria Santos who had supposedly died in a car crash with her 8-year-old daughter in 1993. Bonnie stared at the badge, struggling to process the implications. This can't be right. Maria Santos died 30 years ago. I saw her death certificate. Maria Santos, the wife and mother, died 30 years ago, Jimmy said quietly. But Maria Santos, the federal agent, has been alive and working undercover ever since. She was never a victim. She was the federal coordinator for Project Clearwater. The revelation hit Bonnie like a physical blow. Everything she thought she understood had been turned upside down. The woman she believed was a murder victim was, in fact, the federal agent responsible for coordinating the murders of her own family. The car crash was staged, Jimmy continued, his voice heavy with the secrets he had carried for 3 decades. Her husband and daughter were real casualties, but Maria survived and was given a new identity under the Federal Witness Protection Program. Except she wasn't being protected from criminals. She was being protected from prosecution for her role in the killings. The documents accompanying the badge told a story even more disturbing than the original conspiracy. Maria Santos had been an undercover federal agent investigating organized crime connections in rural West Virginia. Her marriage to Carlos Santos and their daughter Elena had been genuine, but her mission was to infiltrate criminal networks using her family as cover. When the crime families discovered her true identity, they demanded federal authorities eliminate her or face retaliation against other deep cover operations across the country. Instead of extracting her, her federal superiors chose to fake her death and use the incident to test new protocols for protecting covert assets. The other families, the Hendersons and the Kowalskis, they were the real witnesses who had stumbled onto evidence of federal corruption, Jimmy explained. With Santos compromised, her handlers decided to eliminate them at the same time, making it look like a coordinated hit on multiple federal assets instead of the assassination of inconvenient witnesses. The coroner's notes Bonnie had found now made perfect, sickening sense. Dr. Webb had documented evidence of murder, but was told the deaths were necessary to protect federal operations. The systematic cover-up hadn't been local corruption. It had been federal policy, implemented through a network of compromised officials who believed they were protecting national security. Agent Henshaw tried to expose what was happening, Jimmy went on. He realized Project Clearwater had become a testing ground for assassination techniques and witness elimination protocols that violated every constitutional protection he'd sworn to uphold. When he threatened to go public, they killed him and made it look like a suicide. But the most shocking revelation was contained in the communication logs Jimmy had intercepted over the years. Maria Santos hadn't disappeared after her staged death. She had been promoted within the federal ranks, eventually becoming the regional coordinator for operations that used the very techniques that had been tested in their mountain community. She's been back here multiple times over the years, Jimmy said, producing surveillance photos that showed a woman in her late 50s visiting the bunker site and meeting with local contacts, always under different identities, always coordinating new operations that required the same kind of permanent silence Project Clearwater provided. The photos were irrefutable proof. The conspiracy hadn't ended in 1993. It had become institutionalized, a federal program for eliminating witnesses and protecting assets through methods that included the systematic murder of American citizens. The drug trafficking operation is just the latest iteration, Jimmy explained. They used the remote location and the established infrastructure to test new techniques for moving contraband, laundering money, and eliminating potential witnesses. Every operation provides training and experience for federal agents who may need to use similar methods elsewhere. Bonnie realized their mountain community hadn't just been the victim of a criminal conspiracy. It had been converted into a training ground for federal assassins, a place where techniques for murdering American citizens could be refined and perfected, far from public scrutiny. The radio equipment in the bunker suddenly took on a new meaning. It wasn't just a communication hub. It was part of a federal surveillance network, monitoring operations across multiple states, coordinating activities that included the systematic violation of civil rights and constitutional protections. How many other communities are being used like this? Bonnie asked. According to the communications I've intercepted, at least a dozen, Jimmy replied. Rural areas where federal agents can operate without oversight, where local law enforcement can be compromised or eliminated, where entire populations can be controlled through fear and intimidation. The scope of the conspiracy was beyond anything Bonnie could have imagined. They weren't fighting a local criminal organization. They were facing a shadow government program that had been operating for decades, shielded by federal authority, and funded by criminal activities that generated billions in untraceable revenue. But the most immediate threat was the revelation that Maria Santos was in the area right now, coordinating the response to Bonnie's discovery of the bunker. The federal badge was accompanied by travel documents showing her arrival at the regional airport just 2 days ago, the same day Bonnie first opened the steel door. She's been monitoring the situation through the surveillance network, Jimmy said. The radio chatter we've been hearing isn't from local sources. It's coming from federal coordination teams that specialize in witness elimination and evidence destruction. The young reporter who died in a car crash 5 years ago hadn't been killed by local conspirators. He was eliminated by federal agents using techniques perfected over 30 years of operations in their community. His death had been a training exercise, a chance for new agents to practice assassination methods under the supervision of seasoned killers like Maria Santos. We're not just fighting corruption, Bonnie realized, the words catching in her throat. We're fighting the federal government itself. A part of it, Jimmy corrected. The part that operates outside constitutional oversight, that treats American citizens as acceptable casualties in operations that were never authorized by Congress or reviewed by the courts. The evidence they had gathered suddenly felt inadequate against an adversary with federal resources and legal authority. Local law enforcement couldn't be trusted. State authorities would defer to federal jurisdiction. Even congressional oversight committees could be infiltrated or misled by people who had spent decades perfecting techniques for manipulating official investigations. But Jimmy had one more revelation that changed everything. Maria Santos isn't the only federal agent working under a false identity in this operation, he said, producing a file that made Bonnie's hand tremble as she opened it. The current sheriff, Tom Bradley Jr., isn't just the son of a corrupt local official. He's a federal agent who was placed in the position to provide ongoing coordination for operations that require local law enforcement cooperation. The federal personnel records confirmed it. Thomas Bradley Jr. was a graduate of the FBI Academy and had served as a federal agent for 8 years before being assigned to covert rural coordination in West Virginia. His appointment as sheriff hadn't been the result of local politics. It had been a federal personnel assignment, meant to ensure continued control over the law enforcement apparatus that protected their operations. How many other officials are embedded federal agents? Bonnie asked. We're about to find out, Jimmy answered, activating the radio equipment he'd brought from his cache. Because Maria Santos has just issued orders for a full security sweep of the area. Every official, every business owner, every citizen who might have information about our activities is about to be contacted and questioned. The radio hissed with transmissions that revealed the scope of the operation being launched against them. Multiple federal teams were coordinating with local assets to implement what they called a comprehensive threat neutralization. A euphemism Jimmy knew from experience meant the systematic elimination of anyone who might have knowledge of their activities. They're going to kill everyone, Bonnie said, the reality of the situation falling over her like a suffocating blanket. Everyone who poses a potential security risk, Jimmy confirmed. Patricia, because she's been researching local history. The elderly residents at the senior center, because they might remember details from the 1990s. Business owners who might have noticed unusual activity. Anyone who could potentially provide testimony about federal crimes committed in this community. The scale of the planned massacre was breathtaking. This wasn't just about eliminating a few witnesses. It was the systematic murder of dozens of people whose only crime was living in a community that had been selected as a testing ground for federal assassination programs. But as Bonnie processed the enormity of what they faced, she realized Jimmy's 30 years of documentation had provided them with a crucial advantage. They knew the identities, the methods, and the current locations of the people responsible. For the first time in 3 decades, the Watchers had become the Watched. We can't stop them from implementing their security sweep, Jimmy said, his voice a low, determined rumble. Their only hope was to ensure the proof of their crimes outlived the assassins. The question was whether they could get that proof to someone with both the authority and the courage to act before Maria Santos and her federal kill teams completed their mission. A mission to turn their peaceful mountain community into just another successful training exercise for government-sponsored murder. The detailed target list Jimmy had recovered from his deepest cache was printed on official federal letterhead, marked with classifications that traced it to the highest levels of the secret program they had uncovered. 23 names, including Bonnie Walsh, Patricia Vance, and Jimmy Kowalski himself. Each was marked with a deadline for elimination and the specific methods to be employed. Patricia Vance was slated for a car accident within the next 6 hours. Bonnie Walsh, for a home invasion designed to go wrong that very night. Jimmy Kowalski's own death would be attributed to complications from a pre-existing medical condition. A particularly cruel touch, given his terminal cancer diagnosis. But it was the other names on the list that shocked Bonnie, with their sheer scope and apparent randomness. Martha Collins, the owner of Henderson's General Store, was slated for elimination because she maintains extensive informal networks that could facilitate information sharing. Frank Morrison, the director of the senior center, was targeted because his access to elderly residents creates potential for the coordination of historical testimony. They're planning to eliminate anyone who could potentially connect the pieces, Jimmy explained, his voice grim as Bonnie stared at the list in growing horror. Not just people who know about the conspiracy, but anyone who might help others understand what they've found. The timeline was aggressive and chillingly coordinated. All 23 eliminations were scheduled to occur within a 72-hour window, using methods that would appear unrelated to a casual observer. Heart attacks, accidents, suicides, home invasions, medical emergencies, a catalog of misfortune designed to devastate the community while looking like nothing more than a tragic string of coincidences. How do we warn 23 people without triggering the security protocols that would just accelerate their timeline? Bonnie asked, her voice tight with desperation. We don't, Jimmy replied, his tone severe. Warning them would only ensure they die faster and likely take us with them. The only way to save these people is to expose the entire operation, publicly, with evidence so comprehensive that the federal authorities can't ignore or bury it. But the evidence they had gathered, while extensive, was still vulnerable. The authenticity of the documents could be challenged. Witnesses could be discredited or eliminated. Media attention could be diverted or suppressed through channels that had proven effective for 30 years. We need more than documents, Bonnie realized aloud. We need to make the people responsible expose themselves through their own actions. Jimmy offered a grim smile and activated the sophisticated radio equipment he had assembled from scavenged components over 3 decades of secret monitoring. Then let's give them the opportunity to do exactly that. The plan Jimmy laid out was audacious in its simplicity and terrifying in its risks. They would use the Federal Communications Network against itself, broadcasting false intelligence designed to provoke a response that would expose the scope and nature of the conspiracy to monitoring agencies that weren't part of the secret program. The NSA monitors all federal law enforcement communications, Jimmy explained, tuning the radio. But they don't typically analyze the content unless specific keywords or threat indicators are detected. We're going to give them those indicators. He proposed reporting a fictional terrorist cell operating in their area, using code words and frequencies that would automatically draw the attention of the NSA and likely trigger an FBI counterterrorism probe. The secret program's response to this false threat would reveal their illegal activities. But that means we'd be falsely reporting terrorist activity, Bonnie protested. That's a federal crime. We could go to prison for decades. We're already marked for execution, Jimmy pointed out. Prison would be an improvement. The radio crackled to life as Jimmy began his desperate gambit, transmitting carefully crafted messages that mimicked the communication patterns of real terrorist organizations. In moments, automated systems responded with queries and requests for coordination, confirming their transmissions were being intercepted and analyzed by multiple federal agencies. But the secret program's reaction was immediate, and it revealed the true depth of its infiltration. Instead of triggering an investigation, their transmissions were being intercepted and rerouted through channels that prevented outside agencies from ever receiving the intel. They've compromised the monitoring systems, Jimmy said, his face pale with the realization that their plan had failed. Maria Santos and her people have access to the NSA and FBI networks. They're filtering out anything that could expose their operations. The sophistication of the corruption was breathtaking. The secret program hadn't just infiltrated local law enforcement. They had systematically compromised the federal oversight mechanisms designed to police them. But Jimmy's decades of surveillance had prepared him for this possibility. Hidden in his cache of equipment was a communication system that bypassed federal networks entirely, connecting directly to international monitoring stations that could not be controlled or manipulated by American agencies. During the Cold War, European intelligence services set up listening posts to track American military communications, Jimmy explained, assembling components that looked more like ham radio gear than sophisticated surveillance equipment. Those stations are still operational, they still monitor, and they are not subject to American intelligence oversight. The new plan that emerged was even more dangerous than the first. They would broadcast the proof of federal crimes directly to foreign intelligence services, using protocols Jimmy had learned during his military service in signals intelligence. The risk was immense. Contacting foreign agents with classified information was, by any legal definition, treason. But it was also their only remaining option. The British have a monitoring station in Cyprus that intercepts American communications on this frequency band, Jimmy explained as he calibrated the rig. If we can get their attention with the right combination of keywords and authentication codes, they'll be obligated to share intel on American domestic crimes with congressional oversight committees. The international implications were staggering. Evidence of systematic federal assassination programs would create diplomatic incidents that couldn't be suppressed. Foreign governments would demand explanations, congressional hearings would be mandatory, and media attention would be impossible to control. But as they prepared to implement their desperate strategy, the radio they were monitoring suddenly exploded with activity that made them both freeze in terror. All units, security breach at location D. Suspects have accessed classified materials and are attempting external communication. Implement terminal protocol immediately. Terminal protocol? Jimmy's face went white as he recognized the code designation. They're not just planning to eliminate the people on the list, he whispered. They're planning to wipe out the entire community. The transmissions that followed laid out the scope of the protocol in clinical detail. A gas leak explosion at the senior center would eliminate the elderly residents. An electrical fire at Henderson's General Store would destroy a community gathering place and its owner. Multiple accidents would occur simultaneously, creating a disaster that would require a federal emergency response and provide cover to eliminate any remaining witnesses. How many people live in this community? Bonnie asked, her voice barely a whisper. About 400 year-round residents, Jimmy answered, plus seasonal visitors, hikers, tourists, maybe 600 people in the immediate area. 600 people marked for elimination to protect a secret program that had been operating for 30 years. The scale of the planned massacre was incomprehensible, but the radio traffic confirmed it was already in motion. Emergency response teams were staging around the community. Hazmat specialists were setting up near critical infrastructure. Medevac helicopters were on standby. All the components needed for a disaster that would look natural, but was, in fact, a coordinated act of mass murder. We have maybe 2 hours before they begin implementation, Jimmy said, working frantically to complete the international communication link. After that, nothing we do will matter, because there will be no one left to bear witness. Their work was cut short by the sound of approaching vehicles. Multiple engines, moving in coordinated patterns that suggested professional search teams, not random traffic. Rex's alert stance confirmed their hidden position had been compromised, likely through surveillance tech that had been tracking them since the bunker. They've found us, Bonnie said, gathering the most critical evidence while Jimmy kept working. Not yet, Jimmy answered, his hands moving with practiced efficiency despite the closing danger. But they will in the next few minutes. This rig needs 30 seconds to establish the link, then another minute to transmit the data package. The vehicles were closer now, their engines audible through the forest canopy. Rex moved to the entrance of their shelter, his body language signaling multiple threats approaching from different directions, in patterns designed to cut off escape. Can you complete the transmission while we're on the move? Bonnie asked. Not with this equipment, Jimmy replied. The international link requires precise positioning and an uninterrupted power supply. If we move now, we lose our chance. The choice was immediate and stark. Abandon the evidence and flee, or stay and transmit, facing almost certain capture by people who had spent decades perfecting the art of eliminating witnesses. How, how long do we have? Bonnie asked. Jimmy listened to the approaching engines, calculating the probable search pattern. 3 minutes, maybe 4, if they're being cautious. 3 minutes to transmit proof that could save 600 lives and expose 30 years of hidden crimes. 3 minutes to choose between personal survival and the possibility of justice. Do it, Bonnie said, moving to the entrance of the shelter, where she could watch the approaching threats while Jimmy worked on his final gambit. The communication rig hummed to life as the international monitoring stations responded to Jimmy's authentication codes. The data began to flow through encrypted channels, unable to be intercepted by the program's compromised networks. Names, dates, locations, photographs, audio recordings, documentation that painted a complete picture of federal crimes spanning 3 decades. But as the transmission progressed, the sounds of their capture grew closer, more coordinated. Car doors slamming, radio chatter coordinating search patterns, the measured footsteps of professionals who knew how to handle dangerous situations. 60 seconds remaining, Jimmy reported, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool mountain air. Rex's low growl signaled that human figures were now visible through the trees, moving deliberately toward their position. Bonnie could see glimpses of tactical gear and military-style coordination that confirmed they were facing federal agents. 30 seconds, Jimmy whispered, the voices now close enough to make out fragments of conversation about securing the perimeter and cutting off escape routes. 10 seconds, Jimmy said, his finger hovering over the transmission control. The first federal agent appeared at the edge of the clearing, weapon raised and pointed at their shelter. Behind him, more figures were moving into position, making escape impossible. Transmission complete, Jimmy announced, just as the first voice shouted with absolute authority. Federal agents, emerge from the structure with your hands in sight and prepare for detention. But as Bonnie and Jimmy stepped out of the shelter with their hands raised, Rex remained inside, positioned beside the equipment, which was still broadcasting their location and live activity to international monitoring stations. The dog's loyalty had provided them with one final advantage. The real-time evidence of their capture by federal agents would now be streaming to foreign intelligence services, creating immediate international pressure for answers about America's domestic assassination programs. You've made a grave mistake, the lead agent told them, as the restraints were snapped into place. Interfering with federal operations and communicating classified information to foreign governments are capital offenses under the Espionage Act. But Bonnie Walsh had spent 40 years learning that some mistakes were worth making, and some prices were worth paying for the chance to bring the truth to light. As federal agents secured the evidence and prepared to implement the terminal protocol that would eliminate her entire community, she realized her desperate gamble had succeeded in ways they could never have anticipated. The observers had finally become the observed, and the world was now paying attention to what was happening on Forgotten Mountain, a community where federal agents practiced techniques for assassinating American citizens. The two-way radio transcript the federal agents discovered in Jimmy's equipment revealed more than they had ever intended to expose. When Maria Santos arrived at the holding site to personally oversee the interrogation of her prisoners, the radio was still broadcasting their conversations to international monitoring stations, which were now recording every word spoken by the federal agents implementing an illegal domestic assassination program. "Shut down that equipment," Santos ordered, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to absolute control over operational environments. "We can't, ma'am," the communications specialist replied. It's using authentication codes we don't recognize, and the broadcast protocols are resistant to standard jamming techniques. The equipment Jimmy had assembled over 30 years of clandestine operations was more sophisticated than Santos had expected. While the federal agents worked to disrupt the international broadcast, everything they said and did was being transmitted to foreign intelligence services, services that, by treaty obligations, were required to share evidence of domestic American crimes with congressional oversight committees. How long has this broadcast been active? Santos demanded. At least 40 minutes, possibly longer, the specialist answered. The equipment was broadcasting before we arrived and has continued despite our attempts to jam the frequencies. 40 minutes of recorded conversations between federal agents coordinating a mass assassination in an American community. 40 minutes of documentation that would be impossible to deny or suppress through normal channels. Santos realized her carefully planned terminal protocol had become a liability, one that threatened to expose not just the current operation, but the entire covert program that had been running for 3 decades. Implement immediate evacuation protocols, Santos commanded. All personnel are to fall back to secondary positions. This location is compromised. But the evacuation order came too late. The radio crackled with a broadcast that made everyone freeze as they recognized its implications. This is FBI Assistant Director Catherine Morgan, broadcasting on international emergency frequencies. Federal agents operating in West Virginia are to cease all activities immediately and report to designated collection points for debriefing. Congressional oversight committees have been notified of possible domestic crimes, and international monitoring stations are providing real-time surveillance of federal activities in the area. The broadcast was being transmitted on multiple frequencies simultaneously, ensuring it reached not only Santos and her team, but every federal agent operating in the region. More importantly, it was being recorded by the same international monitoring stations that had received Jimmy's evidence package, creating an official record of the federal response to allegations of domestic assassination programs. Santos's face hardened as she processed the implications. The covert program, which had operated without oversight for 30 years, was now under active investigation by legitimate federal authorities. Authorities who could not be intimidated or eliminated like local witnesses. Ma'am, we're receiving stand-down orders from multiple federal agencies, her communications specialist reported. The FBI, DEA, ATF, and DHS are all demanding an immediate cessation of current operations. But Santos had spent decades implementing programs that operated outside of normal federal oversight, and she was not about to abandon 30 years of work without trying to salvage what she could from the disaster Jimmy and Bonnie's investigation had created. Proceed with the modified terminal protocol, she ordered. Scale it back to primary targets only. Make it look like local criminal activity, not federal operations. The modified plan Santos outlined was still breathtaking in its scope and brutality. Patricia Vance would be eliminated in a home invasion that would also destroy her research materials. The senior center would suffer a gas leak explosion, silencing the elderly residents who could provide historical testimony. Henderson's general store would be hit by an electrical fire, destroying the community's records along with its proprietor. But as Santos coordinated her scaled-back massacre, the radio equipment continued to broadcast her every word to international audiences, who were now coordinating with American congressional oversight committees to investigate federal crimes in real time. Ma'am, the communications specialist cut in, his voice tight with concern. We're tracking multiple aircraft approaching from the south. Military transponders indicate federal marshal response teams. Through the canopy, the thumping sound of helicopters became audible. This wasn't the single medevac aircraft that had been staged for the terminal protocol, but multiple transports carrying the kind of rapid response teams deployed when federal crimes demanded immediate investigation. Santos realized her covert program was facing the one threat it had never been designed for: oversight by legitimate federal authorities, who possessed both the legal authority and the physical resources to shut down illegal operations, regardless of their classification level or political protection. "Release the prisoners," she ordered reluctantly. "Full evacuation of all personnel to extraction points. Implement evidence destruction protocols for all classified materials." But Bonnie Walsh and Jimmy Kowalski were no longer just prisoners who could be quietly eliminated. They were witnesses whose testimony was being broadcast in real time to international audiences, including congressional oversight committees. Releasing them would provide immediate evidence of federal crimes, while continuing to hold them would constitute additional federal crimes committed under international observation. "Ma'am, the prisoners are asking to speak with the FBI agents coordinating the congressional investigation," the communications specialist reported. "Absolutely not," Santos snapped. "Transport them to a secure facility for extended interrogation under national security provisions." But the radio crackled to life again, with a broadcast that made it clear Santos no longer had the authority to make such decisions. "This is Assistant Director Morgan. All personnel operating in West Virginia are hereby ordered to secure the prisoners for immediate transfer to FBI custody. Any interference with this order will be treated as obstruction of a federal investigation into domestic crimes." The approaching helicopters were now visible through gaps in the tree canopy. Federal aircraft, marked with FBI and congressional oversight identifiers, signaled that the highest levels of the American government were now involved in investigating the covert program Santos had spent her career protecting. "Ma'am, we need to evacuate immediately," her senior agent advised. "If we're still here when those aircraft land, we'll be arrested right along with the prisoners." Santos faced a choice for which 30 years of illegal operations had never prepared her: surrender to legitimate federal authorities and face prosecution for crimes that had been sanctioned by secret programs, or flee and spend the rest of her life a fugitive from the very government she had served. But as she prepared to order the full evacuation, Rex emerged from the equipment shelter with something in his mouth that made everyone stop, recognizing its significance. The dog had retrieved a recording device that was documenting their entire conversation, creating yet more evidence that federal agents were coordinating a mass murder while under international observation. "The dog," Santos said, raising her weapon toward Rex. "Don't!" Bonnie warned, her voice heavy with the authority of someone who had spent 40 years learning how justice worked in the mountains. "That dog is smarter than you think, and he's been trained to protect evidence." As if in answer to her words, Rex moved to a position between the federal agents and the radio equipment. His posture made it clear that any attempt to destroy the broadcast devices would require going through a German shepherd trained to defend his territory against human threats. The sound of helicopters landing nearby grew deafening, the rotors washing over the tense standoff.